So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, the fourth class. Is that right?
Yes.
The fourth class in this transforming problems module of the Discovering Buddhism series. Ordinarily, it's been our practice to start with a brief meditation. I'm not going to do it that way this evening. Hopefully there will be a meditation before the evening is finished. Definitely, maybe. But still, we should. It's indispensable for us, whether we start with a meditation or not, to make sure that our motivation is correct right at the very beginning. So by this time, I think all of us have heard enough or read enough about what it means to cultivate a proper motivation, to banish thoughts of selfishness, and to try to use this time together to cultivate some true beneficial qualities in our heart and our mind so that we can be helpful to others. Okay, so last time we ended with a brief run-through of the third stanza, the third set of verses, the gist of which is that the moment we discover a destructive state of mind has arisen, to combat it without delay. Maybe I should just read that verse in its entirety. In all actions, I shall examine my mind, and the moment an unsubdued thought arises, endangering myself and others, I shall face and avert it. Okay. So, as we know from our own experience, all sorts of thoughts and feelings and emotions are continually welling up within us. They change from moment to moment, very drastically often. And some of what arises within us is very positive, very good, very beneficial, such as thoughts and emotions around love and compassion, helpfulness, understanding, and so forth. But some of the stuff that rises up from the field of our mind is, in fact, destructive. The so-called unsubdued thoughts, or the poisonous minds. And the general name that we've been giving to them during these courses for these unsubdued negative states of mind are the delusions. The delusions, that's one way of translating the Sanskrit term klesha, which I think many people here are now familiar with. And we can understand klesha either by giving a list of them, though a full list may take some time, because according to the teachings there's 84,000 delusions. Fortunately, I've never had to see or memorize such a list. They are instead abbreviated. And if they're abbreviated down to just 3, what are those 3? What are the 3, what are called the 3 root delusions, or the 3 poisonous minds? Ignorance, someone said?
Attachment.
Attachment?
Fear.
And hatred. okay? That's one way of listing them. There are synonyms as well, but what was just said now, the first one was ignorance, and the next one was given as hatred or anger. You could also say aversion or repulsion. All of these understood here in these contexts pretty much as synonyms. And then the other one, left to be mentioned, is sometimes called attachment, desirous longing, sometimes simply greed. Here again, being understood more or less as synonyms. Sometimes we can differentiate. If you take one delusion and you call it attachment or longing or desire or greed, you can distinguish some qualities between those. But here I'm just giving it a very general approach. So if we say all of those words and get the general gist of it, then we understand what's meant by this root delusion. Okay. Of these three, ignorance and hatred and attachment, which is the most basic? Ignorance. Because it is from ignorance that not only do the other two delusions arise, hatred and attachment, but all of the subsequent delusions, which are in a sense permutations or combinations of the preceding three. And when we come to the last verse of this text, this brief text, the 8th verse, and when we, in the next module, when we talk about the cultivation of wisdom, we're going to be specifically concentrating on the uprooting of ignorance and the cultivation of wisdom as the final, ultimate antidote to the delusions and all the problems that derive from the delusions. Here, however, in this course, the first 7 stanzas, we're not concentrating so much on basic ignorance itself as we are on the other delusions which arise from it. It is an important topic and it does come up, but it's most especially discussed in the 8th stanza. Now, if we had to give a general definition for a delusion, something that would cover attachment, hatred, jealousy, arrogance, and all of these other negative states of mind, if we had to sum up what the common characteristics or the defining characteristics of them all are, how would you explain it? What would you say a delusion is? Here I'm not specifically talking about how does this delusion differ from that, but what is common about all of these klesha? Yes?
They're mental constructs?
They're mental I didn't hear the last part.
Or conceptions?
Mental constructs or conceptions, yes. But that, while that's good, it doesn't go far enough because certain positive states of mind are also mental constructs. So here we're talking specifically about negative states of mind.
Destructive emotions?
Say?
Destructive emotions?
Destructive emotions, that's getting much closer to it. Destructive emotions, but in a functional sense, what is a destructive emotion? What does it mean to be destructive? Way back there, I think Sarah.
They're harmful to yourself or others?
They're harmful. They're harmful to oneself or others. Yeah, they're definitely harmful to oneself or others. Mm-hmm.
They're based on a sense of separation.
They're based on a sense of separation. Well, that is starting to get into that topic of the root delusion of ignorance. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's starting to touch on it. Yes?
They're all based on a misunderstanding of reality?
Right, they're all based on a misunderstanding of reality. That shows its connection with the root delusion of ignorance. Because the ignorance we're talking about is the ignorance of the way things actually exist. and they derive from that. Yes?
Does it have to do with attachment?
Well, attachment is one of them,
Oh, that's just one of them.
and yes, though it's interesting, attachment, in some teachings, the root delusion, or the root of all problems, let's put it this way, the root of all problems is said to be ignorance. But there's other texts in which Buddha says the root of all problems is attachment. Right? And it sounds as if maybe Buddha doesn't know what he's talking about. Right? But in this case, in fact, what is being emphasized here in each case is the functioning of these delusions in our mind. The deep root cause of all the delusions is this ignorance, this misunderstanding the nature of reality. But from that, the chief delusion which arises from that is attachment. Because even hatred could be understood as arising from attachment. In other words, we cultivate, or we hold on to a fictitious sense of self, a misunderstood, misconceived notion of oneself. That's in the province of ignorance, the root delusion. But once that's there, once we're holding on to it, then attachment arises towards that sense of self. So those things that we want, that supports that sense of self, that separate sense of self, to those things we generate attachment. But we're also attached to getting rid of what we don't like. So hatred is a form, we could understand it as itself deriving from attachment. So it's this ignorantly generated attachment to the concept of self that gives rise to all of the other delusions. Okay. Now, what I was looking for when I asked that question about what the common quality was for all the delusions, and many people touched on it. Oh, yes, please.
Self-cherishing.
Self-cherishing. Yes, self-cherishing gives strength to all of the delusions. Mm-hmm. But what I was looking at specifically, and it's not as if the answers missed out. They're all very good. But one of the functioning ways, one of the ways of understanding the quality of the delusions from a functional point of view is that a delusion is defined as that state of mind which, the moment it arises, disturbs our peace. Okay? So if something arises and you maintain a sense of calm, peace, clarity, then it's not a delusion. But if something arises and it does disturb that sense of calm and clarity and peacefulness, that is the very definition of a klesha, a delusion. Now, sometimes this disturbance is almost immediately recognizable. We might find ourselves saying, "Oh, I'm so upset I can't eat," or "I'm so upset I can't think." So that means something's arisen in the mind, usually some form of anger or hatred. Somebody's really gotten under our skin. Maybe it could be anything from something we hear on the news to just something that's happening around our house. And it causes this anger, this hatred to arise, this feeling like we're getting red in the face or starting to shake. And we are upset, and we even say that we're upset, which is an indication that beforehand, even if things weren't so great, they were going along relatively okay. But with the arisal of that state of mind, we become upset. Of course, it is a kind of human nature to blame our being upset, not on the delusion itself, but on what we think of as the object which caused that delusion to arise. So we don't blame our being disturbed or upset on the anger. We blame it on our husband or our wife or the person on the news or whoever it was who was the object that was the trigger or the stimulus for that anger to arise. And this marks a very major shift between what we could call an ordinary worldly approach and a dharmic or a spiritual approach, the approach being cultivated especially in these Lojong teachings. And that is that in the worldly approach, we tend to view our the various obstacles to be overcome, the various things that are disturbing our mind, the experiences that are interfering with our happiness. Pardon me. We tend to view them as if they were all external. You know? So if we say, who's your enemy? Then we look outside to find the answer to it. You know that commentator, he always says something to piss me off. You know, my husband, he never puts the tube back on, the top back on the tube of toothpaste, and on and on and on, like that. So the object that's causing the disturbance is identified as out there. From the dharmic point of view, yes, these are conditions. Those are conditions for the delusions to arise. But the actual enemy, the actual problem, is the delusion itself. And that we have to take responsibility for. Okay? I said before that some of the delusions, when they arise, such as, very, very, this kind of red-in-the-face type of anger, is quite obviously upsetting. Jealousy is very obviously upsetting. There's nothing pleasant about it when we feel jealous. We know that from our experience. But some of the delusions are rather sneaky. Like when strong attachment, when strong longing arises, in truth, it does disturb our mind. Whatever peace we had before, whatever sense that things were kind of all right that we had before, is momentarily disturbed by the arisal of that attachment or that desire. We're walking along the street and we look at something in the shop window, and I don't know what individuals like, but whatever it is, whether it's a suit of clothes or a sports car or whatever it is, when we see it, if the thought comes up, oh, I wish I had that, right? Then, in fact, at that moment, the mind has become disturbed. It's become restless. But we tend not to identify that as a disturbance. We give it another name. It's excitement. It's the spice of life. Our kind of eyes grow a little bit wider and start to glisten. We tend to become more alert. Kind of like before we were a little bit sleepwalking, and now kind of our senses are right there, right at the ready. There's many qualities to such a state of mind, attachment, which actually have a certain positive flavor to them, because they do arouse energy. But the restlessness that goes along with it, the longing that goes, the dissatisfaction that tends to go along with that, those are delusions. Those are disturbances. And much of the spiritual training involves being able to separate out from the arisal of a desire, for example, those qualities which are useful and can actually help in the way we live our life and the way we practice our dharma, and those which are solely disturbing. And those are difficult discriminations to make. Okay. So, then a klesha, a delusion, a disturbing emotion, as someone said, an afflicted emotion, as we sometimes read in certain texts. These are all states of mind which, when they arise, disturb ourselves, and, as also is indicated, set in motion the creation of harm for ourselves and for others. Because it's from the arisal of these various delusions that motivate those actions which give harm to others and ourselves. In other words, if that car in the shop window is attractive enough, we'll break the glass, go in and steal it. My son was watching a movie based on that premise just the other day. Right? So, and obviously, when we think about, those of us who've taken the module on karma, for example, or have received teachings on karma, we understand that karma isn't created from thin air. It's motivated. It's intentional action motivated. If it's negative karma, it's motivated by the delusions. If it's positive karma, motivated by something else. But the kind of negative karma which brings harm to others and then eventually harm that comes back like an echo upon ourselves, that is motivated by these various delusions. So delusions are harmful the moment they arise, and they set in motion harm which can come back to us at a future moment. So here, in the third verse, the third stanza, the advice is regard the arisal of the delusion as an occasion for being extremely alert. And instead of putting up with it, try to combat it right away. Okay. And I think I may have quoted His Holiness when I spoke about it briefly last week, though I don't quite remember. He was saying, there's a Tibetan expression, oh, it'll probably be okay, it's probably all right. In other words, it's kind of a laissez-faire attitude that, okay, something arose in my mind, it's probably okay. It doesn't matter. It might be jealousy, it might be anger, it might be attachment, but there's nothing I have to do about it right away. It's probably okay to just go along with it for a little while. And he says the Tibetan expression is, don't make friends with it's probably okay. Don't make friends with that attitude. Because that attitude of just saying, oh, it rose, and maybe even justifying, saying, oh, that's just natural. My doing something to combat this delusion is unnatural. It rose naturally, so, why should I have to do anything about it? Those are mistaken. Those are mistaken attitudes. Because it's the arisal of these delusions themselves that perpetuates our unhappiness. And ultimately, which prevents us from fulfilling our highest goal, and that is to be beneficial, for our lives to be beneficial to others. So there are a number of different strategies to employ when the various delusions arise. And in the handout that I gave, just a few of them were outlined. So, for example, if what is mainly arising is anger, then the chief opponents to anger are patience on one hand and love on the other. I'm not going to go into in-depth discussion of these points. I just want to go over them briefly. This is something that we've discussed in past modules and something that we can talk about in the future as well. When the delusion, however, is one of this kind of restless attachment, then then again, there are a number of different opponents that we can apply. One opponent is simply remembering impermanence. Simply remembering impermanence. Impermanence was among the very first teachings given by Buddha, and it was the very last teaching given by Buddha. As he was passing away, just before he passed away, he said, all compounded phenomena, means everything that comes together due to causes and conditions, everything that we can perceive through our five senses, all compounded phenomena are impermanent. Work out your own salvation with diligence. Those are the last reported words of Buddha as far as my readings have shown me. Okay? So this idea of impermanence is extremely important. Otherwise it wouldn't have occupied such an important place in the very beginning and the very end of his teachings. So, when our mind or heart is gripped by this kind of restlessness which comes from obsessive attraction to something, it can be very helpful to just recall this object to which I am attracted is impermanent. It's going to change. It's not always going to look as glossy, flashy, attractive, smooth, alluring. It isn't always going to be that way. And we could say, well, what a bummer. What kind of depressive way of looking at things, always looking at the, at the fact that everything's in a state of decay. But in fact, it's true. If that's a bummer attitude, it's at least legitimately a bummer attitude. Right? Because things, everything that you can see, hear, smell, taste, touch, all of these things are constantly undergoing change. I think it may have been Aldous Huxley, I'm not sure, but I think it was he who came up with the phrase, perpetual perishing. Perpetual perishing. Things are in a constant state of flux. And it's good to remember that, especially when our mind is being disturbed by an obsessive attachment. Because by remembering it, our grip on that object, that obsessive grip on that object, will relax. Now, a lot of us, I think, rebel against this kind of advice, or kind of almost are affronted by it. Because again, it seems to take the whole spice, enjoyment out of life. So what we have to keep in mind is there is nothing wrong with liking something or enjoying something. That's not where the problem lies. Remember, the definition of a delusion is that thought or emotion which, as it arises, causes us disturbance, causes us to lose our peace. So if we look at something attractive, or if we taste something delicious, or if we hear something pleasant, that very reaction of finding that object pleasant, of simply liking it, in and of itself contains no delusion. Is our mind disturbed when we see a beautiful sunset or a rainbow? Usually not. Rainbow is a good example. Lama Yeshe used to use it because there's something that's truly attractive. I mean, what else do we see in our life has colors like a rainbow? Almost nothing, right? Extraordinarily beautiful. But we know there's no way of possessing it. We know that. And therefore, we simply admire it. So in the admiration of the rainbow, in the simple, plain enjoyment of it, in the simple liking of that experience, there is no delusion. There's pleasure.
And we know it won't last.
And we know it won't last, and we know that we can't possess it. Right? Now, how could a rainbow cause a problem? I can think of an example. We see something, incredible vista, beautiful rainbow, and we think, I've got to take a picture of it to bring back to show my friend. And then we go in the car, we bring out the camera, and we kind of get the perfect thing, and then by the time we're there, it's starting to fade already and get really pissed off and angry. Okay. Now, did that disturbance, did that come from merely liking the rainbow? Liking the rainbow was not the cause of that. Becoming attached to a certain preconceived idea, oh, I'll do this and I'll do that, and present this and present that, You know, trying to catch that kind of lightning in a bottle, you know, and preserving it. That was the threshold. That was where the delusion came in. Okay? And we should keep this in mind because Buddhism gets kind of a bad rap, both from outside of Buddhism and even from practitioners within it, as some kind of life-denying or happiness-denying doctrine. Okay? And that is not what is essential. And Lama Yeshe often says there's nothing wrong with enjoying things. The only thing that's wrong is that, and we are often predisposed to elaborate upon that simple attractive quality, the simple liking. In other words, to project onto it qualities which you can't possibly live up to. And that's where attachment gives rise to problems. Okay? So, remembering the impermanent nature of things is one way of loosening our grip when the mind has become restless with desirous attachment. In the handout that I gave, which is from various readings of ours, it simply says, for attachment, meditate on ugliness. And I think I said a few words about that last time. And that's kind of an affront, a more direct affront than just simply saying, meditate on impermanence. But here, it's actually quite serious advice, even though the way it's phrased is a little bit shocking. And that is, we tend, in many cases, to be attracted to a superficial quality of an object. In other words, the object is it's a three-dimensional, rounded thing of some type. And our attention seems to remain simply on the surface, you know, on the glittery, smooth, shiny, attractive surface. Meditation on ugliness is simply saying, just look under the surface. You know, because when you, if you're unlucky enough to get, you know, to be able to possess what you covet, in other words, you not only covet it, you not only are attached to it, but you actually get to own it, you're going to end up owning more than the surface, right? The underbelly comes along with it, okay? So what are you going to get? You're not just going to get the attractive surface. First of all, the attractive surface is impermanent. It's impermanent. It's not going to stay attractive. That's what we talked about before. But even before that, even before the object shows signs of decaying or deteriorating, or growing old or wrinkled, even before that sets in, the object itself has qualities in it that aren't that attractive. And most of these advice here is to use to counter, you know, what we refer to as passion or lust, this kind of sexual attraction which overestimates the quality of another man or another woman. Okay? And here, in this case, it's quite true that what we're attracted to on this level, on this kind of very kind of basic level, is this surface appearance of things. You know? So we see signs of that in our culture all the time, don't we? You know, we even call them glossy magazines, right? Because there's a picture of an attractive woman or an attractive man, and the whole emphasis is on the outward show of, you know, the body, the posture, the expression, and so forth of that attractive man or woman. Okay. There's an expression was, you know, she was really attractive until she opened her mouth. You know? And the same thing could be said for a man as well. Right? You know, that there are, you know, these kind of male models that are kind of popular in Hollywood, and they kind of really look good from a distance, but then if they ever get interviewed, you know, then they really come across as dodos. You know? So this is a kind of an indication that, all right, there's a surface quality of attractiveness, but what comes along with that? What's underneath it? So, and here in this meditation, they're talking about if you just go under the skin a little bit, you come up with objects which are not, which no one finds attractive, right? You know, if you watch ER on television, they might bring in a very handsome man or a very beautiful woman, but once they start cutting them open, there's nothing greatly attractive about the guts, you know? Right? So, since many people, especially those who are very seriously intent on following the spiritual path, may find that this sexual attraction is causing a great problem in their being able to get deeper into their meditative practice, then the suggestion is, all right, if that is what is disturbing your mind, if that's what you're obsessing about, then just look under the surface. That's what meditation on ugliness means. And then again, the strong attachment that had previously arisen will dissipate. Then there's other suggestions to combat the other individual delusions, which we won't go into at this point. But the main emphasis here is that do something about the delusion when it arises. Don't think it's just okay. And if we have nothing in our arsenal, if we have nothing strong enough to combat a particular delusion, you know, if we don't know how to meditate on emptiness, which is the ultimate weapon to destroy the delusions, if our meditations on passion and love just aren't strong enough to combat the hatred that's arising in it, if our meditation on impermanence or ugliness isn't strong enough to combat the attachment that's arising. In other words, if nothing that we know or nothing that we're familiar with is strong enough or we're familiar enough with to use to combat the delusion, then at the very least we can withdraw from the situation. Right? We can either physically withdraw, so and avoid this confrontation with the object that's causing these delusions to arise. We can do that. Or we can mentally withdraw. So, for example, in the precepts that are given to monks and nuns, for example, it's advised for them not to go to certain places. You know, places of public entertainment and so forth like that, or places where kind of greed and anger and so forth are on display. Because being at those places has an effect on our mind. So if we're trying to keep a still mind, if we're trying to gain a deeper goal, then it's good to avoid the places that are going to cause those delusions to arise. Whenever that advice is given, they always say, unless there's a greater purpose. And sometimes there is a greater purpose. You know, like accompanying someone else who maybe needs the break, you know, needs to go out and have some kind of mindless fun. That could be helpful. Or simply to observe how people are reacting in the world, or to cultivate compassion, then it's possible to go to places which cause the disturbances to arise. But here we have to really be skillful. You know, if something is going to cause a problem for our mind, why should we expose ourselves to it? You know, that's the question we have to ask. Anyway, that's something we can talk about more. And then mentally withdrawing means that it's like we take the attitude of like a duck towards water, you know, that the water will just go off or just kind of wash off without leaving an imprint. In one of Shantideva's works, which is very widely quoted in this text, or in the commentaries to this brief text, Shantideva says, pretend you're a piece of wood or stone. In other words, just don't react. Okay. So as I indicated before, this isn't very profound advice, but sometimes it's the best advice. If you know that the reaction is going to be destructive, that in a moment or two, very strong jealousy is going to be raging within us, or hatred, or obsessive attachment, then pretend you're a piece of stone, a piece of wood, unfeeling. And it's possible to do that. Okay. That is not going to eliminate delusions. That's not a final method. But to get through this situation on this day, it can be very effective. I remember when I was young, people used to say, count to 10. Right? You're going to get angry, just count to 10. Well, again, that's not a profound technique, except it works. If you feel this anger building up, and you start counting 1, 2, you're still angry by the time you reach 3, but by the time you get 4 or 5, it's kind of starting to pass. And when you reach 10, it may no longer be there. Wasn't very profound, but it was practical. It worked. Okay. What's profound is to meditate on emptiness. But that isn't always very practical. Especially when we don't really know how to meditate on emptiness. Okay? So we have... Lama Yeshe used to refer to Dharma as like a supermarket. There's a whole range of techniques that we can employ, and it's up to us to find out which one is going to be effective. Which one are we prepared for? And in this respect, I want to say one thing before we leave stanza 3, and that is, at the beginning of our session, we tried to cultivate a compassionate, altruistic motivation. Specifically, if we can generate the motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to attain enlightenment for the sake of benefiting others, then this is the highest, this is the best motivation that we can have for any of our activities. And this we've discussed extensively in the last module and in this module. It's come up many, many times. Lama Zopa Rinpoche has a very interesting way of referring to the process of cultivating the bodhicitta. He sometimes uses the phrase, a fabricated bodhicitta. And what this indicates is that for someone who's already a bodhisattva, for someone who has the bodhicitta as his or her primary consciousness, primary way of relating to the world, bodhicitta doesn't have to be fabricated. It's part of his or her very being. In other words, when a bodhisattva opens his or her eyes and sees someone, that bodhisattva is seeing that being with the eyes of bodhicitta. In other words, may I become enlightened to help that being. That's just how it appears. That is the primary conscious approach, the primary attitude, motivation of such a being. And it rises spontaneously. But for most of us, I would imagine, this isn't a thought or an attitude which arises spontaneously. That isn't the first thing that pops into our mind when we see another being, is it's important for me to become enlightened for that being's sake. Right? But if we stop to think about it for a minute, or 2 minutes, or 3 minutes, we can cultivate the bodhicitta attitude. In other words, we can fabricate it. Here, by fabrication, I don't mean fake. I don't mean that. I mean, it's creating something which isn't arising spontaneously. It didn't arise spontaneously by itself, but by turning my mind in a certain direction, I can cause it to arise. Right? Okay. And this idea of fabrication, here in terms of fabricated bodhicitta, can be used for pretty much any of the Dharma qualities that we're trying to cultivate. If they already came naturally, there wouldn't be any need to practice them. Right? So what practice is to generate or to become familiar with a certain line of thinking or way of looking at things so that positive attitudes do arise in our mind. And sooner or later, they become natural. I said before, some people say, okay, if something arises in my mind, I really shouldn't do anything about it because it's just arising naturally. Well, the only reason that hatred and attachment and jealousy arise naturally is because we've cultivated them in the past. They are an inherent aspect of our mind. Right? It's because of lifetimes of giving in to jealousy and hatred and attachment and arrogance and those things. It's because of that they arise so easily. That's the only way in which they're natural, is because we've prepared for them, right? And even in this lifetime, we often put a lot of effort into fine-honing our jealousy and our attachments and our hatred, We kind of learn ways of enhancing those qualities. So then when they arise strongly, we might say, oh, that's just natural. Well, it's only natural because we trained for them to arise. Okay? So the same thing, if we've trained unconsciously for the arisal of the delusions, now we can train consciously for the arisal of the positive qualities, such as love, compassion, bodhicitta, and so forth. So in the beginning of in that training, it is fabricated. It is, to some extent, artificial. But the hope, the aim, is that by becoming familiar with these approaches, then the positive states of mind will arise naturally, spontaneously. I'm going to stop for a brief break. But before I do, I wanted to mention something here. Some people may have noticed it in the handout. Under 3, for the third stanza in C, under where it says 3C, some of you have that? Hmm? Yeah, from the, on top of it says notes from the readings to the transforming problems module. If you don't have it, you can get a copy to you, but I'll just read it now what it says here. It says, negative thoughts arise from past conditioning, not because we are bad, that was inherently bad. So we should not go along with or make friends with it's probably okay. So this we've been talking about. The mind takes on the flavor of whatever we grow accustomed to. With familiarity, everything can be accomplished. And all of these phrases, all these are taken directly from various teachings, nearly all of them by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I've just abbreviated them and squeezed them together in one paragraph, except for the last sentence. The last sentence is, well, it's not even a full sentence, it says, story of me and spiders.
So you're gonna tell that for us?
So I thought maybe people wanted to know what that was all about.
I wondered what that was.
I've been in the Dharma business now for about 33 years or so,
Business.
and I don't have very much to show for it. So when I come up with something that I can point to, I don't mind sharing it. So, especially if it's a little bit ridiculous. So, a number of years ago I was living in Boulder Creek, but we were in the process of leaving there to move into Soquel. And I wanted a little caravan, a little trailer that I could put stuff in and keep it in the backyard, and maybe even use as a little office, which in fact I ended up doing for a while. And I found such a thing right there in Boulder Creek. I saw an advertisement for it, so I went over and was looking around at it, and eventually did buy it. But as I was looking around, the lady who was selling it showed me that to get in and out, there's a little wooden staircase, just one that has about 2 or 3 steps on it, but you put it next to the door so you can actually walk up into it. Otherwise it's a very high step out and kind of dangerous when you leave. So she was showing me that, and then she picked it up, moved it over, and then went away to do something. And then I looked, and I saw that where she had removed these wooden steps, there was these 2 black widow spiders. And I was, because they like kind of dark, damp places, and so it must have been could have been there for years, and it's maybe the first time they moved, so there they were. So I was standing there looking at them, and I was thinking, those are black widow spiders. It's not good for them to be around here. It's, not safe for us. It would really be better to move them, but gosh, I don't really want to pick them up. I'm kind of scared of them, but it would really be good if I could get it over into the bushes somewhere. So I'm kind of standing there, kind of looking, trying to figure out, is there, a long pole? Is there some way that I could possibly move them, without hurting me? And I'm kind of standing there, kind of thinking, just trying to, because nothing was coming to my mind, so I was kind of, engrossed in this thought. And the lady came back and she said, what, is there any problem? And I said, well, and I kind of gestured in the direction of the spiders, kind of indicating, well, that's, kind of thinking about them. And she says, oh, that's no problem. Stop. She killed both of them, just like that. And when I was a kid, I remember going to a parade down the block. We used to go just a couple of streets away from my house whenever there was a parade. And when the bass drum went by, I loved it because they'd hit the bass drum and I could feel it here, They'd hit the drum, but it was like they were hitting my chest. It was an incredible feeling. And that's what it felt like. She kind of, sent them to their next life. But it was like she was smashing me in the chest, at that moment. And I was kind of like shocked by it. And when, just a moment or two later, I realized that reaction that the woman had would have been no different from my reaction all during my life up to a few years before that. Because I hated insects and spiders and was terrified of them all growing up, all the years I was growing up. The only thing that would have prevented me from actually killing the spider is the fearful thought that maybe as I was stomping on them, they would bite me. If I could have dropped something really heavy from a distance, maybe I would have done that. But, I didn't really want to put my foot too close to them. But I realized that what this woman was kind of kindly demonstrating to me, without meaning to, was me up until a few years ago. Exactly me. There's a problem, just kill it. Like that, without a second thought. And there was no second thought for her. She just went on with what she was doing. There was no, there's no obvious problem for her. Right? Problem? Just get rid of it. Like that. Right? And I realized that just simply through the exposure to the Dharma for so many years, and through the simple meditation that, that His Holiness always teaches, that just as I want to be happy, so does every other living creature. Just simply that, nothing more profound than that. The thought of harming the spider, of killing the spider, of just getting rid of it that way, it didn't even come up in my mind. And actually, in a sense, it was almost a fault on my part, because it didn't come up in my mind at all, I didn't stop to think that's probably what's going to come up in her mind. If I had thought that far ahead, if I hadn't been so kind of engrossed in my own thoughts, when she came, I wouldn't have drawn her attention to them. But because it was so far from my thoughts, the thought of harming them or killing them was so far from my thoughts, it didn't occur to me that if I indicated that they were there, that's what I was, turning my attention to, that, this reaction would have followed. And while I was certainly not happy that the spiders met their demise like that, and I certainly wasn't happy to even be slightly party to the fact that this woman had killed them, I was, on the other hand, extremely pleased, because I realized that the me at that moment, and the me of a few years previous, and all my life up to that point, were different. They were very, very different. that what I thought was second nature, you know, oh, you know, a scary insect or a spider like that, get rid of it, you know, that was natural to the John of the previous years. And now the thought of, what could I possibly do that could protect the life of these creatures without endangering anyone else's life? In other words, I don't want to take them from here and put them somewhere where they're going to attack someone else, so I have to think of a place that they can go that they can be safe, but it's not going to endanger others. That reaction was now natural. You know? For years it had to be fabricated. Now it was so natural that I lost sight of the fact that it isn't natural for everyone. Okay? So, I only put that in, I certainly don't put that in as self-praise, because there's a lot of stupid parts to that story. But I only mention it because, for me, to have thought that I could become familiar enough with that thought, that all beings want happiness, that I have even the slightest concern for the welfare of a black widow spider, I would have been incredulous if someone had told me that as I was growing up. And yet here it was, that was how my mind was now working. You know? So what may have started out as a fabricated compassion, at least in this regard, became part of a basic attitude. And so it is possible. So I took a bit of time speaking about the third stanza, even though we had talked a bit about it last time, because I think it really sets the tone for all the remaining trainings indicated by the 8 verses, and in fact all of the Dharma teachings in general, to basically to recognize where our problems are coming from, to break that habit of thinking that our problems are coming to us from the outside, that to cultivate the idea that we are responsible, and that there is something that we can do about our mind, about our heart, about our attitude, and that this will have a truly transformative effect on our lives. If we become sensitive to that point, as embodied in the third stanza, then the trainings in all the rest of the stanzas begin to make sense on a much deeper level, I feel. So let's look at stanza 4 now. Whenever I see a being of wicked nature, who is overwhelmed by heavy non-virtue and suffering, I shall hold him dear as if I had discovered a precious treasure, difficult to find. The way that stanza is translated, it sounds as if the person being described is someone who's mean or wicked and is also experiencing suffering, you know, non-virtue and suffering. But what's really meant here is describing a whole bunch of different experiences that the people that we run into may have. We may run into people who are, who we could say are of a wicked nature. In other words, people who act sadistically as a matter of habit. We might run into people who are experiencing great mental or physical torment. We might run into people who are very poor or who are outcast in some way. When His Holiness talks about this stanza, he often refers to them as those people who are in our society who are marginalized. There's the people on the edge. The people who, when we're walking down the street, if they're there, we tend to want to look in the other direction, right? Whether it's because of some deformity or poverty or bad vibration that we're getting from them, like that. So here, it's this stanza is alerting us to the fact that this tendency on our part to go along with this marginalization, in other words, to kind of quite actively ignore or turn our attention away from those who are experiencing any of these difficulties is something to be opposed. Because one of my teachers quoted a Tibetan that he knew saying, this person said, I can develop compassion for everyone except the Chinese. Because this person lost his country to the Chinese, right? Right. So that is not universal compassion. That is not the source of cultivating bodhicitta. It's still a biased mind. Something is still being held on to, which is preventing that person's mind from experiencing its fully enlightened nature. So here we can say, I can be nice and kind and open and friendly and supportive to this kind of person and that kind of person and that kind of person, but not to those bums on the street, or not to those people who behave so badly to others, or not to this kind of person, or not to that kind of person. Having that attitude, especially having it in which it's subconscious enough that we don't give words to it. It's kind of a more almost instinctive reaction of turning away, turning our mind away. This verse is saying, pay attention to that. If we notice a tendency in ourselves to turn away from any of these people, right, then instead of following that, instead of saying, making friends with that's okay, that's probably okay, instead of that, instead of just going along with it, turn our attention back. Now in the beginning, we might have to almost physically take our head and push it back, so that we pay attention. Because the instinct to turn away could be so strong. I mean, I'm speaking figuratively here. Right? But here it's saying, instead of turning away, view these beings as if we had discovered a precious treasure difficult to find. And the reason it's said these types of beings are a precious treasure difficult to find is because our goal is very high. Our goal is enlightenment. Our goal is to be able to become an enlightened servant of others. That is the goal. To do that, we're going to have to go through a lot of transformation. There's a lot of mind training involved in reaching that state, or even approaching that state. Okay? And who's going to be the occasion for that mind training? Okay? These very beings. The beings who represent challenges to us. The beings who as the expression goes, the beings who push our buttons. Okay? So, as His Holiness says in some occasion, the ones who are nice and kind to us, they're not the ones who give us the occasion to practice, to overcome non-productive, destructive habits of our mind. Right? When we're with them, we're happy, we're loving, we're compassionate. It's when we're challenged by those who, for any of a number of different reasons, we find repulsive or that we'd rather ignore, they're the ones who show us what we have to work on and give us the opportunity for working on it. Now, again, we have to be sensible. Does that mean if we see someone who's acting in a very sadistic way, or if we see someone else who's undergoing incredible torment, mental or physical, that we run over and smother them with kisses, it says here, think of them as a treasure, difficult to find. That doesn't mean that our outward behavior has to undergo a radical transformation, but rather we look at this person, we regard this person with different eyes, as someone who's actually fundamental to my spiritual practice. I had an experience a number of years ago in Nepal maybe it's worth relating. Where I was in Nepal was very close to this gigantic monument, this gigantic stupa, known as the Bodhanath Stupa. Has anyone in this room visited it? See? A few people have. Magnificent structure, and the practice is to go around turning prayer wheels or reciting mantras to walk around. And as you walk around, there's quite a lot of beggars who congregate there because that's a very good place to receive alms. And on this particular day, I had gone out to visit the place which is just outside the Kathmandu Valley. It's the place where Buddha in a previous lifetime is said to have sacrificed his body to feed a hungry tigress. The place is called Namo Buddha. Very, very well worth visiting this place, just outside the valley. And I think that was where I was visiting on that particular day. And I came back very, very inspired by everything I had seen and all the practice that was going on and everything. And I came back and I knew I was going to pass the Bodhanath Stupa on my way back to where I was staying. So I made sure that I had a lot of coins so that I could make offerings to all the beggars there. And I was so motivated to do this practice, you know, to give of myself in whatever way I could, which even if it's just giving a small amount of money, at least I could do that. And I knew there'd be the occasion to do it, because out at Namo Buddha there are very, very few beggars. It's quite remote, but at Bodha there's a lot. So I was really prepared, and to get all that change, I had to actually. It took a little going. You know, I had to go to different shops and, you know, buy something and get change, and just to collect it all. So I was really well prepared, ready to practice this generosity. And then I got to the Bodhanath Stupa and I walked around, and there wasn't one single beggar there. And I found out later that I think some festival or something was taking place at another religious site, so they had left. So I went around, and I had my pockets jingling with coins, and no one to give them to. Yeah. And at that time, the words of Lama Zopa came back to my mind, words that I'd heard many times before, you know, that our practice of generosity depends upon the kindness of the beggar. And I thought, oh, that sounds nice. That's a nice poetic way of putting it, but come on, you know, give me a break. You know, how's the beggar being kind to me? You know, the beggar's just a beggar. There's no kindness there. But on that occasion, I realized that my practice, my spiritual practice, whatever it's worth, depends on me being able to do a number of things, including the practice of generosity. But one cannot practice generosity unless one has an object. And so the beggars are being extremely kind. Doesn't matter what their motivation is. Their very existence, their very presence is a kindness. How kind? You know, if there's no motivation to be kind, are you being kind? In this case, it was evidently true. Because when they weren't there, I couldn't do the practice. And I really felt it as a loss. When they are there and you give them money, often you don't think that you're actually receiving something from them, that their presence is actually a blessing for us. I don't mean, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's good that they're poor. I'm not talking about that, okay? Right? But just the very fact that there's the occasion to practice generosity depends upon the presence of an object, in this case. And if the object isn't there, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to do the practice. So from that point of view, the poor person is like a treasure. Like, I don't exactly remember what followed. I'm sure I didn't go back up to the house with a pocket full of coins. So I probably managed to unload them on somebody, you know. But I could imagine, I have to be honest, I don't really remember what happened, but I could imagine making my way back to where I was staying, and then seeing someone who was poor, and being overjoyed that now I had the occasion to give away what I wanted to give away, right? So it would be like a treasure. You know, what is the best thing that I could find at that moment? You know, what would be the treasure difficult to find? A poor person. Usually that's not hard to find in India or Nepal. You know, but if you look for one and you can't find one, and then suddenly one appears, it appears as a treasure, as something worthwhile. So when we see someone who is the occasion for us to be able to practice the Dharma, on whatever level, our attitude towards that person can be as described in this verse, as if we had found a valuable treasure. Then, just to briefly make mention, in a number of His Holiness's commentaries on this verse, he actually doesn't talk about the verse itself in great detail. Instead, what he does is he admonishes Buddhists to be more like Christians. Because he says in many Christian societies, it is a practice to pay attention to those people in the society who are marginalized. You know, that to practice charity, to set up hospitals, to work with poor people, diseased people, and so forth. And he says that this is a practice is greatly to be emulated. Sitting in a cave and meditating on generosity and patience and love and so forth is all very well, but we should take care of those who we can take care of, and we should use as an example those people who do it well. And he was talking about it in his trips to Europe and the United States. He was extremely impressed by how many people professing a Christian faith were actively engaged in that kind of activity. This is not to say that in Buddhist societies this is unknown, but there is a tendency to be a bit more cavish, you know, withdrawn, you know, stepping back, taking care of oneself, often to the detriment of actually doing what we can do to help. And so His Holiness was commenting very greatly on this. And the other thing to mention in this same regard is that there has grown up towards the end of the 20th century, and still existing now, a movement which goes by the name of engaged Buddhism. And one of the leading figures in this movement is the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And there's many, many others that I could mention as well, such as Joanna Macy and His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself, many, many others. And this is a recommitment to doing what we can do for those around us, and rather than just simply working in this kind of isolated environment. And as with all things, it's a matter of striking a balance. You know, I think it's a mistake for people to totally cut themselves off in connection with others, and it's a mistake to be totally engaged with benefiting others if one's mind is still very unruly. You know, so we need to sort of do both. We have to withdraw to the extent that we can get our mind into the proper place, and then use that mind to benefit others. If we take Mother Teresa as an example, because I'm using that because His Holiness talks about her in his commentary to this verse. I saw a documentary on her, and she spent the first hours of every morning in deep practice, which for her had to do with prayer and so forth. But that was what she did, so she could engage in what she did the rest of the day. So similarly, if we have to go for an hour or a day or a month or a year or 3 years into meditative retreat to cultivate a proper attitude, well, that can be appropriate. Any of those amounts of time can be appropriate. But ultimately, we have to go back into society and be whatever help we can. So, engaged Buddhism. So that's the fourth stanza. And the fifth one, when out of jealousy others treat me badly with abuse, insult, and the like, I shall practice accepting defeat and offering the victory to others. Accepting defeat and offering victory to others. This is probably one of the single most famous sections of this whole text. Accepting defeat and offering the victory to others. And it's also one of the lines which is open to misunderstanding. One of the lamas who wrote a most extensive commentary to these 8 first trainings and became the author of a text which is very, very widely practiced, studied and practiced on its own and in relation to this. He was turned on to these teachings, to these Lojong teachings, because he heard that phrase. He heard the phrase, or he read it somewhere, accept defeat and give the victory to others, and he went to seek out the person who wrote it, because it so blew his mind. It was so contrary to what he thought. And so he went to find who wrote it, and it turned out that the person who wrote it and his chief disciple had passed away, but the lineage of those teachings were still alive, and he received that. And then on the basis of that, he wrote his text. So, here, what is being overcome, the problem, the enemy that's being overcome, to give it a non-traditional name, we can call it territoriality. You know, like a dog has its own territory, and you kind of enter in that territory, and they bark and snap at you. You know that idea? And then we as humans often have a sense of our territory. You know, don't come into my space, like that. So we know what we mean by that term. Yeah. Okay. Well, there's this. We sort of have a mental territoriality going in many cases, and that is, people can kind of do what they want, but once it starts affecting me, I'm going to fight back. Right? You know, you can do what you want, but don't do that too close to me, too close to my concerns. And often our reaction is aggressiveness. Sometimes it's passive aggressiveness, sometimes it's really active aggressiveness. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's verbal, sometimes it's neither physical nor verbal, but mentally we're kind of shooting arrows at the other person. Right? So, for example, someone says something kind of cutting to us. Right? The first response we might have is to come up with even a better insult that we can say to that person, you know, to put them down. That's a whole culture into itself, isn't it? You know, these put-downs. Right? I think people associate it with New York, but it's not limited. You know, it's not at all limited. So there is this tendency then, when faced with a situation where something in us is being threatened, to take the victory on ourselves and give the defeat to others. Right? To make sure that we're not the one coming out at the short end of the stick. You know, that I prevail. You know, I really put that person down, didn't I? You know, and it could be verbally putting them down, or, you know, if we're strong enough, physically putting them down on the ground. Right? So it's this tendency to prevail over others that is being countered here. Because what's behind this territoriality, or this desire to prevail? Right? Well, ultimately, it comes down to this ego-grasping ignorance, doesn't it? And to the self-cherishing that goes along with it. You know, that we're holding tightly onto myself as inviolate in this area. How dare they say or do something so insulting, you know, so threatening, so this, so that. Therefore, I must come back, you know, come back in spades, you know, give back even more than I get. Take the victory. Give them the defeat. And sometimes it shows itself in very petty ways. Like we're waiting online, and someone comes in, and we don't know whether it's on purpose or an accident, but they get in line ahead of us, or ahead where we think they should be, well, we can get very righteous about that. You know, we can really make a big stink, you know, much, much beyond what's called for. Okay? So that's the tendency that's being talked about. When we notice that, the advice here is to turn the tables, you know, give the victory to others and take on the defeat. But, as His Holiness points out, we have to understand the purpose for this practice and to discriminate between those defeats that we should take on and those defeats that we should not take on. You know? Again, we just shouldn't go by the letter. We have to go by the spirit behind the letter. Remember, this is only effective if it's part of our spiritual training to cultivate this loving, compassionate motivation of bodhicitta so that we can follow the path towards enlightenment. If it doesn't feed into that, then we have to question whether taking on the defeat and giving victory to the others is really the best policy or not. And one of the ways that His Holiness points out that we can discriminate between the two is whether the defeat that we're talking about concerns only myself now, or whether it has a much bigger, stronger effect on others. So, for instance, if it's just simply that our feelings may have been a little bit hurt, or that we feel, you know, that some injustice has been done to us, and it only goes that far, then taking on that defeat and giving the victory to others may not be bad at all, may be appropriate, may diminish our arrogance, you know, may even open up some vein of sympathy for others. But if the person who is acting in this aggressive, threatening, or obnoxious behavior is actually threatening the welfare of other people, or is threatening us in such a way that we can't be beneficial to other people, in other words, is kind of interfering with our ability to be helpful, right? Then that's not the kind of defeat that we should take onto ourselves. We shouldn't give another person victory so that he or she can be monstrously harmful, right? That is not the occasion to practice this, right? So His Holiness often says, if someone is behaving in a way that is truly harmful, you know, harming other people, harming himself or herself, harming our ability to be helpful, then that person should be confronted. Shouldn't be given, if we can. Again, depends on, you know, what our abilities, our strengths, and so forth. If we can, that person should be stopped, right? But with what attitude? Typically, when someone is behaving in an obnoxious or a threatening or harmful manner, when we intervene, when we confront that person, it's often from the point of view of anger, of hatred, of wishing to put that person down, of looking for ways of giving back the harm that that person's giving to him, to her, like that. There's a kind of an aggressive streak of ill will behind it. But from this point of view, even when you're confronting someone who's doing harm, we're doing it out of a desire truly to be helpful, to prevent that person, for example, one possible example, to prevent that person from creating negative karma, the negative karma of harming, of hurting other people. You know, we're doing it out of compassion, realizing that as long as that person is under the sway of such aggressiveness, such anger, he or she is only bringing harm on to themselves. In addition to whatever they're doing to other people, is ultimately harming themselves. So here we have to be careful. We have to know when to take on the defeat and give the victory to others, and when the defeat is so large, in other words, it causes so much harm, it's so intrusive and so destructive that it is to be confronted And as with all things in the Dharma, the ultimate arena in which all this plays out is in our mind itself, in our heart. You know? We can be taking the defeat on ourselves internally, in our heart, while at the same time externally behaving in another fashion. You know, behaving in a strong, maybe even wrathful fashion. It's not so much what we do externally that makes a difference here. It's what our own attitude of mind is. Okay. I think I saw a question or comment.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, how does one go about taking on the defeat and giving the victory to someone else?
If someone is pushing their way into a crowded elevator, we could either, you're not getting past me, or we could just step back. Let the person through. You know, the person doesn't deserve, you know, if we want to be kind of insistent about it, legalistic about it, that person doesn't deserve that place in line, or to barrel into the crowded elevator that way, or, you know, like that. But if I just step back, let that person have their place, give them the victory. Right? That's like a physical manifestation, one possible physical manifestation.
I'm having trouble imagining situations where the person is creating negative karma.
Well, but here the distinction is there's several things that brings up. One is, if whatever negativity is being created is solely inconveniencing myself, does it make sense for me to combat it? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You know, sometimes just stepping back and saying, okay, this is the ripening of my negative karma. I probably was very aggressive to someone else, so now I'm getting it back, so at least it's exhausting it. So yes, go ahead, you know, continue what you're doing. If it's just that, if however it's really affecting other people, then letting them get away with it is a different matter. The other thing it brings up in my mind is, to what extent are we the policemen of the world? In other words, all around us, people are engaging in negativity all the time. And it isn't always up to us to step in and confront each and every one of them. Right? In those situations where we can, which we have the skill and the strength and the ability to do it, then it's actually part of the bodhisattva vow to do that. In other words, if you can create, if you have the means for stopping someone from doing a destructive action, it's part of the vow as a bodhisattva to do it. You can't say, well, in order to stop it, I would have to be very aggressive and maybe even hurt the other person, so therefore I'm not going to do it. Bodhisattva says, no, that's no excuse. Even if you have to hurt the person, do it. You know, if you can actually stop it, do it. Right? But we can't take that attitude to everything negative that's going on in people's minds. You know, it's like that person, you know, bull rushing her way into the elevator with elbows and umbrellas flailing. You know, what can we do in that situation? Maybe there's something we can say, but probably anything that we would do in that situation would just make it worse. So step back. So we have to, you know, be a little bit balanced, decide what we can do and what we can't do. But it's again, whether our internal attitude is expressed outwardly in what we say or what we do, that's up to our level of skill. It's the internal attitude that has to be maintained. That's what's important. Yes?
On an American street, when we can't tell the difference between a truly needy beggar and a college kid who's
Right.
acting like a con job, is the answer to always give?
You know, I kind of hesitate that the answer is to always do anything. You know, even the best advice in the world isn't something we should always do.
Right.
You know, because there are circumstances. If we can give, then giving is good. You know, even whether the person is deserving or not, at least we're practicing giving. But remember, the path to enlightenment is a balance between wisdom and compassion. Right? So the compassionate wish to give is very good. And I think to the extent that we can, we should follow it. But it should be balanced somehow with a wisdom which looks around and tries to understand what's really happening. And sometimes it takes a while. For instance, one of the stupas that I used to love to circumambulate was in Bodh Gaya, the site of the Buddha's enlightenment. And there was a pool not far from there. And there were beggars who would have fish in jars. And so if you gave to them, you'd be buying the fish from them, and then you could set them free. You know, you're kind of like saving the life of the fish. Until you discovered that they're just recycling the same fish over and over again. It was a con job.
Oh dear.
You know, and there was another place, I think in Thailand, and people did something similar with little birds. They had little cages for birds. I only spent one morning in Thailand, so I don't have such a clear memory of it. But they had little cages with birds, and I think they did the same thing. You free them, but then they had a way of trapping them again, and like that. So whether you really think it's any value in getting caught up in that con job, you know, that really depends on your wisdom. Because it seems like you're just perpetuating a negativity. But if you don't know, if you have no way of knowing, then you make the decision, well, I don't know, therefore I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to look for a situation that I do know that my charity or my generosity is going to be beneficial. Or you might say, well, I don't know, but what the heck, you know, generosity is generosity, and you may practice it. You know, so it's really, again, it's something you have to decide. There's no kind of rule. There's no always, this is always right or that's always right. But certainly the more you know, the more informed your compassion is. Let's take a look at the next one, number 6. When someone I have benefited and in whom I have great hopes gives me a terrible harm, I shall practice regarding him or her as my holy guru. This is this goes along with everything that has been said up to this point. We're faced with a difficult situation. Here we're not talking about someone who's marginalized, like a beggar or someone who's on the edges of society that way, that we're turning away from. Here we're talking about someone who is really disappointed us. Someone who by rights, if anything, should be thanking us, and instead of thanking us is harming us. You know, instead of repaying our kindness with kindness, is repaying it with animosity or with harm. And here the advice is, I shall practice regarding him or her as my holy guru. Now, again, regarding him or her. This again is not a call for a specific verbal or physical response, right? Because the verbal or physical response to a guru might be to offer prostrations. It doesn't mean we have to offer prostrations to someone who's just screwed us. You know? That's not what it's talking about. It's not the outward manifestation, it's the inward manifestation. And this, in a very strong way, actually relates to stanza number 4. The example that I used in stanza number 4 is of someone poor giving us the chance to practice generosity. That we can't practice generosity without the kindness of someone to receive that generosity. You know, the kindness of the beggar. Okay? Here, this is taking the very similar kind of attitude, but here, the practice is the practice of patience. The practice of not retaliating with harm to anger-producing situations. Not retaliating with harm to anger-producing situations. Okay. Patience, again, is just a word, and its use can be misunderstood. But what patience means in this context is, it is the direct antidote to that kind of anger. or hatred that wells up within us when we feel something unjust has happened to us. So this is a advice to view the person who harms us, who returns our kindness instead of returning it with kindness, returns it with harm, to view that person as our teacher, specifically as our teacher of patience. And as Holiness points out, he says, we don't learn patience from our friends. You know, we only learn it from our enemies, or our so-called enemies. Okay? It's only the person who behaves to us like a bastard which gives us the opportunity of testing and practicing our patience. And again, this is only a worthwhile practice if we have a higher aim in mind. So we have to remind ourselves, what is that higher aim? The higher aim is to cultivate a state of consciousness in which there are no delusions or interferences or projections or misconceptions between me and reality, in which my compassion, my wisdom, and my skill to benefit others is maximized, is limitless. That is the goal. That's the goal. Enlightenment for the sake of others. There is no way of cultivating such a goal, to achieve that goal, without that precious bodhicitta motivation, that compassionate bodhicitta motivation. And there's no way to cultivate that universal compassion without patience. Without patience, without the ability to step back from situations which ordinarily would cause us to lose our temper, to strike back, to become angry, and to treat that situation, instead of with its accustomed anger, with understanding, with love, with compassion, with patience, in a word. You know? Without patience, there's no way of achieving that compassion. Without compassion, there's no way of developing bodhicitta. Without bodhicitta, there's no way of achieving enlightenment. So here, the practice of patience isn't just because, you know, it's I'm a religious person and religious people should be patient. It's not just staying in that kind of limited sphere. It's because this practice of patience opens up the ability to cultivate true compassion to all beings, which is absolutely necessary if our attainment, if our interest in attaining enlightenment is to be anything more than just some nice words. Okay. So, viewing others as a teacher of patience, then is what's being talked about here. And when I was thinking about this verse before coming here, I thought of an analogy from an area which I don't usually think about very much. I'm personally not very much into astrology, but I've had some friends who were, and some who had many, many interesting things to say about that field. And one thing that I found very interesting was someone was talking about these aspects, these squared aspects. And if you have a horoscope and you have these squared aspects, this is often interpreted as a problem. You know, the astrologers say, oh, you've got a problem in this area of your life because you've got this, you know, Venus has squared your moon or something like that. So you've got this problem, this difficulty. And but this other astrologer that I spoke with, this person who seemed to be approaching it from quite a different point of view, said, these are not problems. You know, these are opportunities. These are challenges. Because if you find someone who has no squares on their chart, they're going to have a kind of a okay life. But they're going to probably end that life where they started it. There's not going to be that much opportunity for growth. If you find someone who has the kind of life which could result in really positive growth, then those challenges, those squared aspects are present. not as insurmountable problems that I want to do without, but as challenges, things to deal with, things to work with. So, now, I don't know, you might think astrology is the pits, you might think astrology is fantastic. I'm not putting that out as an advertisement for or an attack against astrology. I'm just saying that something that's a difficulty isn't a difficulty from its own side. It's only a difficulty in terms of our interpretation. The same thing that somebody might find as a great difficulty is an opportunity to someone else. Right? So I think that's very much what this stanza is talking about. That in our life we face disappointments. This specific disappointment is a very cruel one. To receive harm from someone who should be helping us. That's very cruel. That's very hurtful. Okay? But here, the question is, how do we react to it? Do we react by saying, I wish I never helped you in the first place, and I'm never going to ever help you again, and here's some great harm that I just thought of that I can do to you right now? That's a very, very common response, isn't it? You screwed me, I'm going to screw you. But if you say, well, that really pressed my button. That really hurt. That's an indication that I'm holding on to something very, very tightly. Some limited conception of self, some strong self-cherishing, some misconception about the nature of reality. If I didn't have any of that, this person returning harm to me would not cause this kind of reaction. So there's an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to exhaust negative karma rather than create more negative karma. It's an opportunity to cultivate patience and open up the doors to compassion. It's all of these possibilities, and it's being provided to me by this kind guru. Right? And the kindness of this kind of guru, the more you think about it, is rather extraordinary kindness, because the kindness that this person is giving to us, by being a bastard, right? Right? Before we talked about beggar kindness, now this is bastard kindness. Right? This is really extraordinary, because it's quite obvious that this person is creating great harm for himself or herself. To be ungrateful, to receive something and then to return harm for it is a sign of a really diseased mind, isn't it? I mean, if we've ever done that ourselves, we know what kind of, horrible place that comes from. And when someone else does it, we can assume something is really rotten there. Something's wrong. It's like, I used this example much earlier when I said, if we see a small animal or a child fall, everybody's instinct is to try to help it, try to save them. And I said at that time, if a person doesn't have that instinct, if the person just sits back and kind of laughs at that situation, we can say there's really something wrong with that person. That person has experienced that person's wounded. Somehow, no person who's unwounded would react that way. Okay? Well, here we're faced with a similar situation. If someone gives help to someone, and that other person returns harm for it, that's a sign of a wounded person. There's something fundamentally wrong there. There's a delusion being held on to very, very tightly. And therefore that person is serving as our teacher, our guru of patience, and is doing so at great cost to himself or herself. So once we realize the extent to which that person is creating suffering, not suffering to us, but suffering for themselves, for himself or herself. Once we realize that, then that really opens up the possibility of feeling compassion for them. There's an example, and I think maybe I'll use this as a closing. many, many times in the commentaries to these verses, references is made to a text by the great Indian master Shantideva. He lived somewhere around the 8th century, so roughly, 1,200, 1,300 years ago in India. And his masterpiece is a book called The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And can I see hands of people who have received teachings on that book? A fair number, but a lot of people haven't. Of all of the Buddhist texts that have ever been written, I would say this is the one that the Tibetan Lamas love to comment on the most, is Shantideva, either directly or indirectly. It is considered the best guide ever written for becoming a bodhisattva. And this low jump tradition directly comes through Shantideva. So when Lamas are commenting on this very short text, at the same time they often quote sections of Shantideva's teachings or commentaries on Shantideva's teachings. And in Shantideva, there's a section where he says, thank God for the glass of water, because I didn't remember where I was. But it came back, thank goodness. In it, there's a dialogue that he sets up. And the dialogue goes something like this. The question is, if a person hits you with a stick, do you get angry at the stick? And the answer is no, because the stick didn't hit me by itself. I get angry at the man because it was the man who manipulated the stick. And then the response, Shantideva's response to that is, if you don't get angry at the stick because it was manipulated by the man, then why get angry at the man who's simply being manipulated by his delusions? If you're going to get angry at anything, get angry at the delusion. And then what follows from that is delusions don't belong to anyone. They're not the private possession of anyone. So if we're going to attack the delusions, we have to attack our own delusions. Okay? So all of that comes from Shantideva. And this indicates that things happen to us in our life, and we can either take a superficial interpretation of what's happening, like blaming the stick, or we can look deeper. And there are certain times when actually we are impelled to look deeper, more deeply, I guess. We're impelled to look more deeply, even if we don't have a spiritual practice behind us. For example, if we have a child who has normally has a kind of a very sweet and loving disposition, and then one day the child comes up to us and starts acting almost insane, and starts, pounding us, even to the point that it actually hurts us. The child's strong enough to actually hurt us. Then, while we're kind of protecting ourselves from the blows, we're asking ourselves, what's wrong with the child? If someone kind of walks along the street and just accidentally bumps into us, if we're in a self-cherishing mood, we're going to get angry at that, even though it didn't hurt very much. That person bumped into me. Why don't they look where they're going? Was that on purpose? Kind of all these defense mechanisms come up. But here in this case, with the child, who's actually physically hurting us, instead of reacting with anger, we become curious. Is there something wrong? And then when we touch the child's forehead, we see that they have a fever, a really strong fever. And we say, oh, the child is acting in this unaccustomed way because it's under the influence of this delirium caused by this fever. So the more the child strikes us, the more harmful the child is to us, the more we feel compassion, not the less. We don't get more angry at the child, we get more concern for his or her welfare. And we do that whether we've heard a lick of Dharma in our life or not. Right? Right? That doesn't depend on spiritual training. Right? We know that this behavior is unaccustomed. and therefore we'll put up with the blows. We'll still protect ourselves from it if it hurts. You know, I'm not saying we say, hit me more. We don't say that to the child. We'll still protect ourselves, won't we? But we don't do it out of, you know, that kind of narrow, selfish concern. You know, we're doing it so that we can touch their forehead and find out if they do have a fever or if there's something else wrong with them. Okay? So all that the Dharma is saying, all that the Lojong teachings are saying, is to accord that same kind of understanding to others. It's easy to accord it to a cute, you know, cuddly child. It's harder to accord it to someone who is, you know, our age and should know better and has returned harm to our kindness. You know, who has really behaved like a right bastard, you know. It's hard because that person isn't cute and cuddly. But that person is as much on fire with the fever of the delusions as that child is on fire with his or her fever. As much, if not more. Because that child's fever, once you kind of give it an aspirin or some water or a nap or whatever is necessary, will leave. But that other fever, that fever of anger, the hatred in the heart of that other person, isn't going to leave by itself. Isn't just going to suddenly exhaust itself one day, because it's perpetuating itself. You know, the anger leads to harm, creates karma, which comes back on that person in a harmful situation, which induces more anger to arise, and then it just keeps, samsara just keeps rolling along. Right? So the fever that's causing a person to harm us is a much, much more virulent strain than any kind of fever that our child might have. And therefore can be the source of a compassionate reaction, not a harmful reaction. So, it may seem that in the previous weeks I spent time and time not even getting to a verse, or barely getting through one, and today we did 3. But I think it's appropriate. Even among the commentaries that I've read, this is not a bad balance. And that leaves us time to contemplate the 7th and the 8th verses with a bit more latitude and to get into some other things related to that. And within those 2 remaining verses, there is great things to be achieved, to be understood, and to be practiced. So we just have just a few minutes left. And what I would like to do, since we didn't have a meditation to begin with.
Stop. The clock is.
Oh, it's stop, is that why?
Yeah.
It's 9:20.
Oh. Here, I was so proud of myself. We're going to actually stop before time.
Time stops for Dharma.
That's your clock? Someday.
I just thought we were on time.
So much for the
My goodness. You know, I do have a clock in front of me, but I set it up in such a way that I can't really read so well. Size you are on that one. Okay. So, if we don't have time to do a meditation, then at least, oh, this is something I did want to say, whether we run out of time or not, I just wanted to point this out. In the material that I handed out last time, on the bottom it said how to use these stanzas. Just sitting and thinking about how nice it is to, you know, what a good practice it would be if I could take on a small defeat to achieve a large victory of spiritual progress, all these things. That's not enough. We're constantly in our life running into people, you know, family members, friends, strangers, acquaintances like that. These are the people that we should try to put these verses into practice with. You know. If a person says or does something annoying to us, you know, and we notice that we're coming up with a snappy remark, a rejoinder, you know, that we're getting angry, that we're kind of marshaling our forces to attack that person, at the very least, note that, at the very least. A step beyond that is refrain. Refrain from doing that. Try to cultivate the opposite, okay? That's our opportunity. We use the phrase Dharma practice. We use that all the time. It's my Dharma practice. Well, this is the practice. You know, the practice, we meet a difficult situation, try to react to it or respond to it in an unaccustomed manner until the unaccustomed manner becomes familiar, becomes the accustomed manner. That's what practice means. And we won't get it right the first time, or the first 100 times maybe. But the more we do it, the more it becomes part of our repertoire, or so I've heard. So we can all do our own individual dedication of whatever merit we may have gained here, and I hope to see you next week again. And be a little bit careful because the outside was dry, and now with this rain, it gets slick. So please, as you go out, watch your stepping.